Russia has announced a financial first. It's about to issue sovereign bonds denominated in Chinese yuan. Moscow says it's diversifying, but the real story is that Russia is running short of dollars and euros and is swimming in yuan from trade with China and desperate for new ways to plug its growing budget gap. The issuance of these bonds is a sign of just how dependent the Russian economy has become on China and how sanctions are reshaping its financial future. Hi, welcome back to the channel. As you've just heard, the Russian government is currently considering issuing a new tranche of sovereign bonds that will be denominated in Chinese yuan. And this is the first time that Russia will have issued bonds of this nature. Some corporates in Russia, at the start of the war in Ukraine, did issue some corporate bonds that were denominated in yuan, but that actually stopped relatively quickly because there wasn't much demand from China to buy those bonds. And since the sanctions have been put into place, obviously financial institutions in China wouldn't want to be getting involved in anything to do with Russia. Now, interestingly, the Kremlin has decided that it's going to issue the first tranche of this bond, and it's going to be sized at 400 billion rubles, which is around about $5 billion. So a reasonably big number. And these bonds will have maturities ranging between 3 years and 10 years. So relatively long-term money. And the reason why Russia is doing this is because nobody wants to buy any bonds that are denominated in rubles. Now, historically, they would have sold those bonds to financial institutions within Russia. Maybe some corporates in Russia may have bought them. Even some citizens may have decided that they wanted to buy into those bonds. But given what's happening in the Russian economy right now, there is a lack of liquidity within the Russian market. So Russia is now having to come up with new ways to raise finance to keep the war in Ukraine going. So why is Russia doing this right now? Well, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that over the past few months, and particularly over the past few weeks, we have seen a real ramp up in the sanctions. Donald Trump sanctioned the two biggest oil companies in Russia. That was the first time that Rosneft and Lukoil have actually been hit with direct sanctions. And that's caused shockwaves all around the world, and particularly in Russia. So China and India are now pulling back from buying oil directly. And this is a major threat to the income that Russia has been living off over the past 3.5 years since the war in Ukraine started. So Russia is now having to think about raising debt to finance the funding gap. Now, one of the problems that it's got is that if it raises debt in rubles, nobody really wants to buy it. And also, lots of corporates in Russia are sitting on huge amounts of Chinese yuan because the deals that have been done with China are being paid for in yuan. They don't want to pay in rubles because rubles is basically a dead currency to everybody apart from Russia. So these corporates have built up large amounts of income from selling their oil. And they're struggling to be able to use it because they don't want to buy lots of things from China. So what the other alternative would basically just be to convert it into rubles, but the exchange rate is not good. And also, what are you going to do with those rubles? You can't trade internationally with them. So the lack of access to the euro and dollars from Russia's point of view is really causing them a problem. So the Russian government is trying to be clever by issuing these bonds denominated in Chinese yuan in the hope that some of the corporates in Russia will use the huge amounts of yuan that they've got sitting around in their bank to buy these bonds because lots of that money is now locked up. So basically, they can't do a lot with it. So what does this tell us about the state of the Russian economy? Well, it tells us, firstly, that Russia is now becoming more dependent on China. It's already dependent in terms of the sale of oil and gas and other things like coal, but it's now becoming dependent from a currency perspective. If we have a look at some of the stats, around 1/3 of all Russian trade is now settled in Chinese yuan. 1/3 is settled in somebody else's currency. Yuan deposits in Russian banks have now overtaken US dollar holdings, so it's the biggest foreign currency in Russia. Yuan loans, so corporates in Russia taking out loans that are denominated in Chinese yuan, have tripled since the sanctions began. And the reason why they're doing that is because if you're having to pay interest and repayments on your loan, and you're sitting with a huge amount of Chinese yuan in your bank account from all of the sales of oil that you've made to China, then you don't want to take an exchange risk on that. You don't want to have to convert it to rubles and then pay the interest and the loan. You basically would be safer to just pay the interest and the repayments in Chinese yuan because your currency is matched off. You don't have any risk of losing out on that exchange rate. So that's why yuan loans have really taken off. The central bank in Russia intervenes on a daily basis in yuan to manage the exchange rate because it's so important to the Russian economy now. And the yuan has effectively replaced the dollar as Russia's working currency. So this tells us that Russia is really now very dependent not just on the trade with China, but also on the currency of China. And the problem that Russia is facing right now is that its budget deficit is continuing to widen because it's spending more than it's earning. And that situation is getting worse on a daily basis as it's losing sales to India and China. The ruble market internationally is very shallow. The only countries that are using ruble apart from Russia are countries that don't really have much choice when they're dealing with Russia. So let's think about countries like Egypt and Cuba, Venezuela. When they're dealing with Russia, Russia is telling them, they're dictating to them, you have to use rubles. But if you have a choice, if you're India or China, and you just say, actually, we don't want to deal in rubles, what's Russia going to do about it? They still need you to buy all of that oil. And if you're only prepared to pay for it in somebody else's currency, then they're just going to have to take that on the chin. And that's what's been happening over the past 3.5 years. And that's why Russia is now having to resort to things like issuing bonds in yuan, because ruble bonds are basically not interesting to anybody. So what risk does this throw up for the Russian economy? Well, there's multiple risks from this. Firstly, the yuan isn't freely convertible, and Russia may find it difficult to move money abroad because not a lot of other countries, apart from Russia, are happy dealing in yuan. Certainly, the United States and the West prefer to use dollars and euros rather than Chinese yuan. The secondary sanctions, which have been ramping up hugely over the past couple of months, really could cause a major problem for Russia because if the Chinese banks and Chinese corporates and Chinese investors decide that those secondary sanctions are now just too risky for them to get involved in anything with Russia, then it would mean that there'd be zero demand for any sort of financial instruments coming out of Russia. The exchange rate between the yuan and the ruble also adds new volatility to this government debt because if the ruble weakens against the yuan, then any debt that you've issued in yuan will cost you more in terms of having to repay it, and also the coupons that you're paying out to the investors every 6 months. They become more expensive as your currency weakens. If China decides to tighten its trading rules or the relationship between the two countries cools, then Russia is in big trouble because it's issuing bonds in Chinese yuan. And obviously that's not a great position to be in if you don't have a long-term relationship with the country that's issuing that currency. And Moscow is basically outsourcing its monetary stability to Beijing here. And that's a big issue, I think. This isn't something that Russia would have been happy doing with the USA, for example. It wouldn't have issued lots of sovereign bonds in US dollars because it then is intrinsically linked to the dollar and the US economy. But that's what it's doing with China, and it's now very much intrinsically linked with the Chinese economy. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking a lot about the ramping up of the sanctions over the past few weeks and how this is hurting the Russian economy. And the announcement that Russia is now issuing sovereign bonds, so these are state bonds issued by the government in Russia in Chinese yuan, I think is a really big story because this tells us that Russia is no longer confident that if it issues sovereign bonds denominated in rubles, that they will be taken up, that anybody will want to buy them. So it's an indication that Russia is really struggling in terms of its currency. But it also tells us a number of other things. Firstly, it tells us that Russia is having to issue debt. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia hasn't actually raised a lot of sovereign debt historically. Its GDP to debt ratio is relatively low compared to other developed economies. But because of the war in Ukraine, it's now spending significantly more than it's earning. So it's running up a deficit, and the only way to fund a deficit is either to use your cash, which it has been doing from the National Wealth Fund for the last 3.5 years. But that National Wealth Fund is now running dry. And so Russia is having to turn its attention to debt because it needs to keep accessing cash to get the capital to pay for everything. It's moved to this wartime economy. So it's sponsoring lots of different businesses in Russia. It needs to keep paying them. It needs some money to do that. So as the savings run out, it's now turning to debt. So that's an issue from Russia's point of view in the first place. The second issue here is that it's struggling to be able to issue debt in the normal way. In the normal course of events, it would issue this debt in Russian rubles and firstly sell it to Russian corporates and investors, and then maybe in the past it would have sold those bonds around the world to fund managers, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all of those sort of guys. But because of the sanctions, nobody overseas wants to buy those bonds. And also, nobody wants to deal in rubles. So it's a double whammy from Russia's point of view. So it has been relying on Russian corporates. But as you'll be aware, Russian corporates are now struggling. Some of the big corporates have reduced their working week to 4 days because they're struggling with lack of revenue, lack of profits. And so some of them are now making losses. So they're no longer as interested in deploying their surplus capital into sovereign bonds because they don't have any surplus capital. And also the fact that borrowing costs at the moment in Russia are over 20%. The interest rate sitting at 16.5. But obviously a bank will need to make some profit on top of that. So it'll probably have a margin of 3 or 4 or 5%. So you'd be paying 20-ish% every single year on any money that you borrow. So that's discouraging all of the corporates from doing that. And instead, they're using their cash reserves to fund any capex or investments into their businesses rather than buying government bonds. So Russia is struggling in terms of the market, and it's now decided that the best way forward is to issue these bonds in Chinese yuan. And the reason that they're doing that is that some of the corporates in Russia are sitting with huge amounts of Chinese yuan in their bank because they're being paid by China in yuan. They don't have a choice. They can't get rubles from them. And also, some of these corporates prefer to be paid in foreign currency because over the last 3 years, we've seen a significant deterioration in the value of the ruble. So the international purchasing power has gone down. And also, nobody actually wants to get paid overseas in rubles. So rubles aren't that useful to you if you're doing international business. So lots of corporates in Russia, as a result of the sanctions, are sitting with large amounts of yuan. And the Russian government is trying to tap into that by encouraging those corporates to invest that yuan into Russian bonds. Now, it will be interesting to see how big the take-up is from those corporates. And also, it'll be fascinating to see whether or not there is any demand in China, because these bonds are issued in yuan and they will have a relatively attractive rate to get people to invest. Will Chinese institutions invest for a period between 3 to 10 years, or will they take the decision that this is simply too risky? Because if the sanctions continue ramping up, or if the Russian government is sanctioned, for example, I don't exactly know whether or not that's on the cards, but let's say it was, that would mean that those bonds would instantly be in the sanctions. So you wouldn't be able to receive your payments and get repaid and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of different questions around whether or not Chinese investors would be interested. My guess is that it's simply too risky. There's better alternatives everywhere else rather than investing into a Russian sovereign bond. So I think the demand will be solely contained to Russia at the moment. And this is another example of Russia becoming more and more isolated from the global markets. And when you're issuing bonds, you really want to have access to the global markets to make sure that there's sufficient demand. But the overall summary of today's video is that the Russian government is now having to issue debt to fund its deficit. It's running out of cash. It's struggling to issue that debt in the normal way. And so it's now decided to issue bonds in Chinese yuan. It's hoping that there will be sufficient demand within Russia to take up those bonds. But it will be fascinating to see what happens. And this tells us that Russia is now more and more linked to what's going on in China. And so if the relationship between China and Russia was to break down, that would be catastrophic for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I know a lot of people who watch these videos are not subscribed, so please hit that button. It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a subscription. It's just an indication that you like my channel, and the YouTube algorithm likes that. So you'd be doing me a favor if you did hit that red button. So thank you very much if you have. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've signed up as a patron or a YouTube member, really appreciate that long-term support. And if you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you. Really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.